In this edition of the News Review, one of the U.S. president's top aides has admitted that Donald Trump was wrong to say that China would pay tariffs on its exports to the U.S. Director of the U.S. National Economic Council says American businesses paid the import tax from Chinese goods. Larry Kudlow added that both sides will suffer from the escalating trade dispute. Last year, the U.S. imposed a 10% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese products. Last week, the U.S. said that it was increasing those tariffs to 25%. Trump said Beijing broke the deal by backtracking on earlier commitments to change its policy. Now, to discuss that further, we're joined by Mr. Lawrence Davidson, lecturer at Westchester University, and also Mr. Jason Unruhe, political commentator, joining us live from Niagara Falls. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us on this edition of the News Review. So let's turn to Mr. Jason Unruhe to find out what he thinks about this increase in tariffs. Mr. Unruhe, do you believe that the 25% tariffs on Chinese imports, how will it affect the market and basically the American consumer?
Well, I think in general, anytime you raise tariffs on something, that cost is generally going to be passed on to the consumer. And then as a result, it'll increase the cost of consumer goods. Now, the question is, how much is that actually going to increase? In other words, what is it in comparison to any alternative that is available? Now, the main reason that manufacturing has been shipped to China is due to the dramatically reduced labor cost that comes from the general huge pool of physical labor that's available inside of China, and they can produce goods astronomically cheaper than they could in the United States. Now, I think even with a 25% tariff on these goods, it's still very competitive compared to what would be the manufacturing cost domestically inside the United States. I mean, we're talking pennies on the dollar compared to, say, an average minimum wage of $8 to $10 an hour in the United States. So in the end, it is still going to be cheaper. But on the whole, raising these tariffs isn't going to solve the overarching problem, and that is the trade dispute between China and the United States. This is only going to escalate it. I mean, but that has been Trump's modus operandi, since he came into office, was to simply use force, even if the situation didn't call for it in general. Well, let's be honest. In the trade agreements between the U.S. and China, not either side has been 100% faithful to the actual agreement. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time. But the United States seems intent on turning this into a much larger issue than it actually is. There's been many grumblings about a possible third world war because some of the world wars have been caused as a result of trade agreements, but specifically World War I. But I frankly don't see that being the case in this situation. What we have really between the U.S. and China is a diplomatic problem.
So, Mr. Unruhe, we've heard Donald Trump say that if the Chinese do not sign this deal right now, they're going to have to sign a much worse deal sometime along the road. So what does Trump mean by that?
Essentially, what Trump is saying is that he's playing tough. He's going to make an agreement that he thinks is acceptable, but may not be acceptable to the Chinese. And if they reject it, he's going to deliberately create a worse one later on, that he feels that after a certain amount of time has passed and enough theoretical damage has been done to the Chinese economy, that they'll be forced into. I mean, we've seen this kind of tactic in TVs and movies where someone with a supremely advantaged position in a trade, some kind of a trade ring, whether that be in the supply or the demand, can make that kind of demand on the opposite side when they're holding all the cards. But the thing is that the United States is not holding all the cards in this situation. This, frankly, the way it operates, and is blatantly obvious to many people across the world, is that the United States needs to import from China in order to keep down the cost of goods, which raises the living standards of Americans and many first world people in general. And China needs to export to the United States at this point in the development of their economy. They need each other, whether either side wants to like to admit it or not. And anything complicating that will only hinder that trade that is mutually beneficial to a degree, but both are actually dependent upon. And that's what Trump is not seeing here. He feels that he holds all the cards, he holds all the power, when that is not the case, because we have seen many instances where the U.S. economy is suffering as a result.
Thank you very much, Mr. Unruhe, Lester, and also Mr. Jason Unruhe, political commentator. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for elaborating on this, and thanks to all of our viewers for watching this edition of the News Review.